Dragonflies are amongst the earliest forms of insects. Really, they're like old technology. You know, it's a design that's been around from almost the beginning of insect evolution. But obviously it's very efficient because they've hardly changed at all from then till now. So normally when you think of dragonflies, you think of them as those aerial acrobats, the adult form, but really most of their life is spent underwater. You know, it's the nymphal stage that a dragonfly spends most of its life in the bottom of some pond or a stream, and that nymph may live 1 or 2 years or even longer underwater as a predator.
There's a whole other world goes on below the surface of the water. A world we don't usually see, but a world certainly worth investigation. But if you want to have a look at it, you really got to wade right in and catch a few things up, get them in a jar and have a good look at them. And if you're lucky, you might find you've got some dragonfly larvae. Some of them have maybe been in that pond for 2 years. There'll also be things like tadpoles, fish, frogs, mosquito larvae, all kinds of interesting aquatic insects. When you bring a pond to your backyard, you bring a whole new system of life.
They're hunters when they're adults and they're hunters when they're young. As a nymphal form, they prowl on the bottom of a pond or stream, and they're looking for prey, and they have a sort of a sliding jaw structure which can project forward and reach out and grab things effectively and then sort of ratchet it back in.
They're lurking predators, you know, that reach out and grab things that are foolish enough to get too close. So they prey on the unsuspecting. A freshwater pond has to be one of the most fascinating places you can imagine. It's absolutely abuzz with life. Because it's an aquatic environment, you also see structures that are sort of unfamiliar to us air breathers. You know, they often have really interesting gills and siphon devices and things like that. That makes them very strange and otherworldly. You know, they almost look like something from an alien landscape, and I guess they are. Things like mosquitoes. They're living at the surface, but they drop down for feeding or predator evasion, and they do this great little wiggling motion to get down into the water column. You've also got creatures like caddisflies that are, you know, really weird sort of creatures with very soft bodies, and to protect themselves, they actually build a house that they carry around on their back. They glue sticks and twigs and bits of rolled up leaf and everything all molded and cemented together to form this perfect little protective device. You're also going to find all kinds of beetles. Some of them are diving beetles. Some of them hunt at the surface. All these sorts of things, of course, are fodder for dragonfly larvae. There's also a lot of creatures who will also make a meal of a dragonfly larva. Creatures like predaceous diving beetles and water scorpions and giant water bugs, all very formidable-looking creatures. You know, with a dragonfly nymph, it's essentially a race against time. You know, they have to grow as fast as they can to be able to reach the adult stage. In the meantime, they've got certainly no shortage of enemies that can still easily make short work of them. Not very many of the eggs that are hatched actually grow up to be dragonflies. Most of them get picked off, they're food for somebody else. That's the role of most creatures out there, to be food for somebody else. If you live underwater all the time, the way you have to get your oxygen is you have to get it right out of the water, so you really do have to have gills. In the case of a dragonfly, by having the water draw in one end of the abdomen and expelled out the other, it really is like a jet propulsion system. That allows them to make a quick escape from a predator. And then they just kind of disappear again. The extended period of feeding and growing for dragonfly nymphs finally culminates in the emergence into the adult form. Physiologically, this is a very traumatic moment. A nymph has to leave the water to emerge as a flying adult. Everything has to change instantaneously, from how they get around to how they breathe. It's a very drastic change. It's an awful lot like being born.
They're still not ready to go. The wings have to dry out, the body has to harden before they're ready to fly. And that's quite a process.
Dragonflies are very ancient machines, pre-programmed to fly. So almost from the moment they emerge and their wings are dry enough, they're able to fly like aces. Dragonflies are incredible to watch. They can go up to 30 miles an hour, and their aerial acrobatics would be the envy of any test pilot. Now what they have to do is lead a very, very different life. They have to be able to snatch prey out of the air. They have to be able to spot them over long distances. They become almost exclusively visual predators, and visual predators in a three-dimensional world that's very different from the one underwater.
To be successful, dragonflies have to outgun their prey. One of their advantages is their huge eyes that allow them to see more detail than almost any other insect. And they're mounted on the side of the head so they can see up, down, side to side in almost every direction. Then to be able to outfly and outmaneuver their prey, they have to have wings that are specially arranged so that the front wings are mounted separately from the back wings, so they can independently change the angles of the wings. This gives them the ability to hover, fly straight up, straight down, straight side to side, or even fly backwards. Furthermore, they've got this long abdomen that acts as a stabilizer or rudder, which gives them superb maneuverability so they can catch their prey on the wing. These creatures have magnificent levels of control.
Damselflies are like the delicate cousins of dragonflies. You can distinguish them when they're at rest because damselflies have much narrower wing surfaces. And when they rest, they actually fold their wings over their back, whereas dragonflies have their wings extended and forward, sort of like an airplane. Damselflies are also very different to watch when they fly because it's more like the motions of a butterfly. The wings of both dragonflies and damselflies are transparent. They don't have any scales on the surface like butterflies and moths do. They're very, very thin structures, but they're rigid, and what you can see is a fairly thick set of veins that move all through it. And this interconnected bridge work, if you like, of veins really makes the wing more rigid.
On a hot summer day, you can see all kinds of dragonflies patrolling around the pond. And it's nice to have them buzzing over your head because although they'll eat almost any small flying insects, they particularly like mosquitoes. An individual dragonfly might eat a couple of hundred a day, and that makes them pretty effective mosquito control. And the way they do this is by snagging them out of the air and eating them on the wing.
Dragonflies eat, for example, all kinds of flies and butterflies. They'll eat small moths and mosquitoes. They'll eat almost anything that flies, as long as it's not too big. Both dragonflies and damselflies have a weird habit of perching. And if you sit there and watch one sitting on its perch, you can see its head turning, swiveling as it searches for females to mate with or potential male competitors, other males that might want to compete for his territory. But he's also looking for prey. So from their perch, sometimes a prey item will move through their visual field and they'll dart off the perch and snatch it out of the air. Dragonflies and damselflies, because they're in the air nearly all the time hunting, are subject to predation by all kinds of predators. Some species of birds, for example, flycatchers, and that'll just snatch them out of the air. But also, as soon as they get near the pond edge, they're easy prey for frogs. Frogs are almost complete opportunists. If it moves and it's close enough, they'll eat it. When the day ends, essentially all they do is they look for a favorite perch. Dragonfly just sits there quietly and hopes that nobody notices.
So at nighttime they can be fairly vulnerable, but because they're not flying, things like bats aren't likely to get them. Because they're up on stalks of plants, a lot of predators really can't get up there. And of course, visual predators can't see their wing patterns or anything at night. So, they're reasonably secure because they just don't move. For the first few weeks after they emerge, dragonflies don't just hang around the pond. And even if you don't have a pond in your garden, they will be in your garden because they are able to cover a fairly large territory. They're powerful flyers. They can go for miles. And of course, if you have a good garden with a lot of insects, and to me that's a sign of a good garden, lots of insect activity, then you will have dragonflies. They're everywhere.
They'll find gardens particularly to their liking because a garden has such a diversity of plants and therefore a diversity of insects. It's like a smorgasbord for dragonflies. And dragonflies are usually hovering higher above your garden, and they'll be picking off things like horseflies and deerflies. On the other hand, damselflies in your garden will often be very low in the vegetation, poking around looking for small insects. So it might be winged aphids or winged ants, midges, and small flies. If you want to guarantee that you're going to have lots of damselflies and dragonflies in your garden, the secret is not only to give them habitat for the food that they eat, but also give them a place to breed. By having a pond, you're going to guarantee yourself a bigger population of damselflies and dragonflies. The kind of pond you need to attract dragonflies and damselflies doesn't have to be too spectacular. It can be fairly small. It should be deep enough that it doesn't freeze right to the bottom so that the nymphs can survive the winter. The other thing is, if you want real success with dragonflies, you have to try to keep back the predators like fish. If you've got a couple of big fish in a small pond, they're pretty much going to pick it clean. It's also important to have lots of vegetation right near the edge, partially submerged vegetation, or even vegetation that grows on the edge of the pond and dangles down into it, so that the dragonfly nymphs can crawl up those stalks to transform into adults. It's important to have lots of vegetation anyway in a pond, because the more vegetation you have, the more prey there's likely to be. You won't have lots of other forms of life unless you have lots of plant material.
The flying adult stage of a dragonfly's life is actually quite short, usually only 6 to 8 weeks. And the first 2 weeks are spent out in the gardens and fields eating like crazy to build up the energy reserves for the next step, the return to the ponds for the all-important goal of sex, passing on their genes to the next generation.
Males are usually territorial, so they try to ward off other males from the best territories. And then the females show up at the ponds, and they're dazzled by all these strikingly handsome males with magnificent territories, and when they finally, decide to accept one and they'll mate, you have to be a little envious of them. They can do their mating while they're flying. The whole thing usually takes only a couple of minutes. That part is a little harder to envy, but then they break off, and she's not interested in him anymore. She's got the sperm she needs, and she goes about laying her eggs.
Now, when it comes to egg laying, a dragonfly has to do that near the pond because the eggs have to be able to hatch as nymphs that can enter the water. So she either can lay the eggs on the surface of vegetation right just above the water surface, or in many species what she'll do is directly deposit the eggs one at a time into the water. Of course, the problem with having to lay your eggs one at a time in the water is that it puts you in close contact with lots of predators. There may be fish lying in wait just below the surface, ready to snap them up, or there could be frogs waiting to grab them out of the air. Now, the male actually still has some interest in the female at that point, because what he'd rather not see is for another male to mate with her now, because that would put his sperm in direct competition with the other guys. So at that point, he'll still hang around her and try to keep other males away. And I don't think there's any special rules that females have about being faithful to one guy or anything. I don't really care. So she may lay a bunch of eggs and then move on. When damselflies mate, it's often also a very complex sort of courtship behavior. Male damselflies go through all the trouble of defending territory because they want exclusive rights to the mating opportunities that presents. So often in the process of mating, what happens is other males will try to get in the act, and it's the job of that mating male to try to keep them away. And in fact, even as she's laying the eggs, he has to make a point of really fending off any other males. So he'll go to a great deal of trouble to keep everybody else away and her in the business of laying those eggs after he's fertilized them. Well, once they finish laying eggs, they don't last very long. All their activity is just totally temperature dependent. In the late fall, you might have whole days where nothing happens, they just don't move. When you've had a light frost, for example, you can often find them sitting there absolutely motionless and sometimes even frosted over. Doesn't kill the dragonflies just don't move. Now, eventually, it just gets to be too cold. They can only take so much cold. Once the temperature gets down to 4 or 5 degrees below zero, then they just die. However, below the surface of the pond, crawling around, lying in wait all winter, are next year's dragonflies.
All over Britain, in the spring, clean fresh water fills up with tadpoles. The best known are the tadpoles of the common frog, but they're not the only sort. Curled inside their transparent egg cases, the tadpoles of crested newts look like little fish. When they hatch, they look like little horrors. When their underwater existence comes to an end, all tadpoles graduate to a life on land. But it may not be true any longer to say that they have the best of both worlds. The rich green slime of a stagnant pond is an uninviting sight, especially when it's dotted with bits and pieces of our throwaway society's leftovers. A pond full of rusting metal, tin cans and old bedsteads is an eyesore, but such inorganic refuse doesn't harm the wildlife. Under the surface of some of the untidiest ponds is the home for half of the year of the amphibians, a group of animals which many people find as slimy and unattractive as the pond itself. Others can see the beauty of frogs and newts. To them, their ugliness is only skin deep. The crested newt is black and bumpy from head to toe, but in the mating season, the male develops a fine crest that would make a dragon green with envy. And his offspring, only half an inch long, look even more fearsome than their father. The first of the amphibia to start breeding are the frogs. Their year starts in February in southern Britain, when the males and females pair off for the protracted mating process. The male gets a firm grip of the female round the chest, and in that position they'll stay for an hour or more. With his fingers interlocked, he's impossible to shake off. Eventually, she'll discharge the mass of eggs which makes her abdomen so swollen. And at the same time, the male will release his sperm to fertilize them. The result is frog spawn, a jelly-like mass peppered with small black embryos. Frog spawn is so popular with school children to keep in a classroom aquarium that the very survival of the frog in Britain may be threatened. It has other problems too. They all add up to the fact that frog tadpoles are no longer as familiar a sight in spring as they once were. The development of a tadpole into a frog must be the best known and most often observed of all nature's miracles. Less well known is the intricate process which produces a new generation of newts. These are smooth newts, the more common kind. The male, darker colored with black spots, follows his chosen female, striking poses in front of her in a courtship ritual like an elaborate dance. Because of the way in which the newts mate, almost without physical contact, the correct performance of the dance by both members is very important. The length of time the male can spend in this strenuous display is limited by his need to breathe. If he abandons the female during the ritual to go to the surface for air, she'll be gone when he gets back. This is another reason why the partners must cooperate so as not to waste time. Eventually, they begin the second figure of the dance when she starts to follow him. His next move is to waft an attractive scent toward her through the water with his tail. The last stage begins when the female touches the male's tail with her nose. Then comes the most extraordinary event of all. The male produces a little bag of sperm, and the female follows him and picks it up in her cloaca. If the male has enough breath left, the whole performance will start again. The same pair may mate 3 or 4 times in one session. Their color and the energetic behavior of the male newts in the breeding season makes them too popular in freshwater aquaria and less common in the wild. When the mating ritual is finally completed, the male has nothing more to do. He will retreat to the surface for a breath of air, while the female begins laying her eggs. She lays them on the leaves of water plants with elaborate care. She inspects each leaf closely to make sure there's no egg there already. And then she rolls the leaf up with her hind feet, laying one of her eggs in the middle. Throughout March, April and May, each female lays 200 or 300 eggs, all with the same attention to detail. The egg is covered in a sticky substance which holds it to the leaf and glues the leaf safely round it to protect it from predatory fish. The females look as if they're attempting some daring gymnastic feat, but all they're really doing is ensuring the safety of the next generation, at least until the eggs hatch. Starting about a month later, the female crested newts lay their eggs. When all the eggs hatch, the pond will be packed with tadpoles. The newts have a straightforward, if somewhat grisly, solution to the problem of overcrowding, but for the time being, they seem to be concentrating on producing as many young as possible. For newts, as for most of the other lower animals, an individual life is not important, as long as the species carries on. This overproduction has evolved to make sure that at least some of the resulting babies will survive to adulthood. The eggs take about 4 weeks to hatch, shorter in warmer weather. As the embryo develops inside, a development outside the eggs will make their early life easier for the baby newts. The water fleas are hatching to become an important source of food for the newt tadpoles. Soon the eggshell clears and the baby, looking very like a tiny fish, 1/3 of an inch long, can be seen inside. The first smooth newt tadpoles hatch in April, followed a month later by the first crested newts. They find themselves in a world alive with food, hopping with water fleas. The tadpoles don't have to surface for air. They breathe through their gills, like a pink ruff round their necks. They will soon find that the water contains not only prey, but predators as well. Beneath the surface of a quiet pool in late spring lies a world of violence and death for the tadpoles that have hatched there. What looks like a delicate little plant is Hydra, the freshwater anemone. Its slender arms are loaded with stinging cells, and in its own small way, it's just as deadly as some of its relatives, the poisonous jellyfish. While the tadpoles are tiny, Hydra is a serious threat to their survival. Already, the massive overproduction of the breeding season is being absorbed by the ecosystem of the pond. Hydra isn't the only animal that eats tadpoles. The pond is filling up with carnivorous larvae, among them the offspring of Dytiscus, the diving beetle. It's well equipped to catch moving prey, even fish. Although the fish can usually escape, the tadpoles are often not quick enough to evade those fearsome jaws. Near the surface, The beetle larva makes life dangerous for the tadpoles of frogs and newts alike. On the bottom of the pool, dragonfly larvae lurk near the cover of weeds and pebbles. If the tadpoles keep to the open parts of the pond bottom, they're exposed to the grisliest predator of them all. To the unprejudiced eye, the water scorpion Renatra is a very beautiful animal. It looks and behaves more like a praying mantis than a scorpion, with its grasping arms and piercing beak, and it's an avid hunter of tadpoles. For its victims, Renatra's first embrace will be the last, as its proboscis sucks out the tadpole's body fluids. To frogs and newts in general, such predation is actually a long-term benefit. It weeds out the slower, less active individuals, keeping up the standards for the next generation. Beetle and dragonfly larvae and water scorpions take their toll of the tadpoles, but they have other enemies within their own ranks. They eat each other. A large tadpole sees a smaller tadpole not as a younger sibling, but as a nourishing meal. Consequently, the small tadpoles are very wary little creatures indeed. Of the 300 eggs that a female smooth newt might produce in a season, only 2%, that's 6, will grow up to leave the water for the land. The rest will die in the egg or as tadpoles. The gluttonous cannibalism of the older newts in the pond will eventually reduce the overcrowding to manageable proportions, with just the biggest, quickest and strongest tadpoles left to carry on the race. Soon it'll be time for all the survivors, newts and frogs alike, to leave the water for the next phase of their life, in the air. The frogs will be the first to go, breaking through the surface of the pond, which has been their ceiling for so long. Above lurks a different kind of predator, hunting not for them, but for newts. Children have been fishing for newts in Britain for centuries. They're not very difficult to catch. There's no hook involved. It's a matter of patience. The angler has only to wait until the newt has a good grip on the worm. Striking too soon can lead to disappointment, but the newt seems quite willing to try again. Being captured doesn't harm a newt, provided it's soon moved to more spacious quarters from the traditional jam jar in which its imprisonment starts. Even when it's transferred from the jam jar to swim safely in a roomy aquarium, the newt should be watched closely for signs of molting. The roll of dead skin around its neck shows that it will soon be ready to leave the water. When the molt is complete, the old skin drifts away, looking like the ghost of its former owner. It won't be wasted. Like all the tadpoles that hatched in the spring only to be eaten by their elders, the discarded skin will drop back into the energy chain, perhaps via some of the tiny organisms that will eventually provide a meal for one of the next spring's water fleas. After 98% of them have died or been killed, these are the pick of the season's crop of young amphibians. Each pair of adults has produced, on average, only 6 offspring. This is a very slow rate of recruitment. The froglets soon lose their tails. They no longer need the underwater equipment of a fish. Their gills have gone too, and their lungs have started working. Most important of all, they now have to catch their food. At first, the froglet must concentrate on tiny insects. As it grows bigger, it can take larger prey. It'll need agility and good eyesight to find a living. Unlike the almost blind tadpole, which used to find its food by scent at the bottom of the pond, the frog on land needs to be able to see well and clearly. It must also be able to move fast when the occasion demands. Quick movement not only enables the froglet to catch prey, it helps it to avoid becoming the prey of its seniors. A full-grown adult is nearly 10 times the size of a newly emerged frog. If it's to grow up, the youngster must be ready to jump at a moment's notice. Not all common frogs are green. People have bred ornamental varieties in shades of orange and yellow. The little crested newts, when they emerge in August, don't have to evade their potential predators quite so carefully. They have a secret weapon. The crested newt produces an irritating chemical from its skin, which makes any animal that gets it into its mouth spit it out at once. The taste deters it from attacking any more newts. Armed with their chemical weapons, or just their agility, the young amphibians begin their life on land. The newly emerged newts will stay ashore now for 4 years, until they reach maturity and go back to the water to breed. In early August, captured newts should be released, preferably in a damp place near where they were caught, to avoid reducing the wild population. For the adults, the land is a safe haven from the winter frosts. The smooth newts lead the way as usual, and the crested newts follow a week or 2 later, at the end of August. The rapid fluttering of the newt's throat shows that the transition from water to air involves a considerable physical effort. Since an amphibian doesn't have a diaphragm, it has to force air into its lungs with a pumping apparatus in the floor of its mouth. Without water to buoy it up, a newt finds life on land slow and heavy at first, and full of disappointment. Once they're ashore, the newts disperse across damp fields or along hedgerows until the cold weather sets in. Then they look for a sheltered place to hibernate, under a log or in the bottom of a hedge. Crossing an open field is an arduous journey for a newt in search of cover as the days grow shorter. Eventually, they'll all disappear from sight, to tick over slowly until the spring. If they're disturbed during the winter, newts are sluggish and unsteady on their feet. Perhaps an intoxicated human reminded someone once of just such a sleepy, stumbling creature. In ponds and ditches, a few tadpoles will be left to hide as best they can, to develop into adults the following spring, if they survive. Very few of them do. It's not just the cold weather. Many of Britain's ponds have been drained or poisoned by agricultural chemicals. The few that can support amphibians have been raided, until most of the frogs and newts have gone. Now a new threat is sweeping slowly across Britain from the southeast. A virus is killing the remaining frogs. No one knows how it's transmitted or how it might be controlled. The only hope is to give the frogs and the other amphibians every chance by keeping their habitat clean and by releasing captives in time for them to hibernate. The amphibians might seem to be doomed, but they have a sanctuary which is growing year by year. The majority of frogs and newts in Britain breed as welcome guests in ponds in people's gardens. If only the virus can be contained, or if it dies out on its own, these clean and pleasant surroundings will be an ideal home for the fascinating, if rather slimy creatures. Then they might well be said to have the best of both worlds.